It was the winter of 1945, the kind that froze rivers and hearts alike. The air over central Germany hung thick with smoke and the ghostly haze of artillery fire. In the shattered town of Aachen, where stone cathedrals stood roofless and roads had become rivers of mud, one woman walked alone. Her name was Klara Weiss, a mother of three, widow of a Wehrmacht mechanic, and an unlikely figure in a landscape ruled by uniformed men. She carried nothing but a bundle of cloth and a letter stamped with an American eagle. Snowflakes clung to her shawl as she approached the ruins of the bridge that divided the German lines from the advancing U.S. Army. What she carried in her trembling hands would decide whether she lived or vanished into the fog. Hours earlier, the last German troops had withdrawn through the valley, leaving behind silence and fear. The Americans had crossed the Rhine with a momentum that felt unstoppable. Columns of Shermans and half-tracks rolled through burned villages, their engines coughing in the cold air. But amid the march of victory, war had not yet ended. It merely shifted its form. Patrols hunted stragglers. Civilians hid behind broken walls. To be German in those days was to carry the burden of defeat on your back and suspicion in every gaze. Yet somehow, through the chaos, this one woman had been granted something unimaginable: safe passage. The letter that gave her that protection was signed by Captain Robert H. Miller, a 26-year-old officer from Kansas who had seen too much death to mistake mercy for weakness. His unit, Company C, 36th Infantry Division, had entered Aachen 3 days before, expecting ambushes, not pleas. But when Klara arrived at their checkpoint, holding a child with pneumonia and speaking in halting English, Miller had seen not an enemy, but a mother begging for time. According to accounts from soldiers who served under him, the young captain read her letter twice, then whispered to his men to hold fire if she crossed again. It was a decision that defied protocol, one that could have cost him his command. Yet he made it anyway. Behind Klara stretched a homeland collapsing in slow motion. Allied bombers roared overhead day and night, hammering what little remained of German industry. In the valleys, fields lay black and cratered. In the towns, bread was scarcer than pity. Every family carried its own story of loss. Sons gone to the Eastern Front, fathers buried under rubble, homes turned to ash. The propaganda that had once promised glory now spoke only of sacrifice. Hitler's voice, once a thunder across radios, was now a hollow echo through static. And yet, amid this ruin, some acts of grace still flickered like candlelight in a storm. For the Americans holding the line outside Aachen, trust was a rare commodity. Spies and saboteurs often moved disguised as refugees. The 36th Division had already lost men to booby-trapped bodies, false surrenders, and snipers posing as civilians. Every approaching figure was a question mark. Yet on that cold morning, when Klara stepped from the trees clutching a white scarf, no shot was fired. The sentries watched her walk slowly, her boots sinking into the snow, her children huddled close. One private, barely 20, later told a reporter that it was the first time in months we remembered our own mothers. Behind her lay the remnants of the German 12th Army, retreating through the forests toward the Elbe. They left nothing but ruin in their wake: blown bridges, burned farms, and conscripted boys who barely knew how to hold rifles. The German command had declared any civilian contact with the enemy to be treason punishable by death. Klara knew this, yet she had chosen the unthinkable: to seek mercy from the enemy rather than obedience to a regime that had already destroyed her world. American patrols found her 2 miles from the bridge, sitting beside a frozen ditch with her youngest wrapped in her coat. The child's breathing was shallow, his face as pale as the snow. She refused food until she knew the boy would live. When the medics arrived, they found that she carried a folded envelope sealed in wax, written in both German and English. It bore the faint ink of an American field office, dated months earlier. Within it were words that spoke not of surrender, but of humanity. It was a note of recognition, a promise from an officer she had once sheltered during the chaos of 1944. That man, Lieutenant James Harper of the 2nd Armored Division, had been separated from his unit during the fighting near Hurtgen Forest. Wounded and delirious, he had stumbled into the Weiss family's barn. For 10 days, Klara had hidden him beneath the hay while German patrols searched the woods. Her children brought him bread. Her oldest son risked fetching water from the well at night. When Harper recovered enough to walk, he left behind a slip of paper. "If ever you find the Americans first, show them this. They will know my name." It was that letter Klara now carried, worn and creased, the ink smudged but the signature clear. When the Americans realized what they were holding, the mood in the camp shifted. Harper, then reassigned to a medical detachment near Liège, confirmed her story by radio within hours. He described her voice, her children, and even the cracked porcelain angel on her mantle. Captain Miller, upon hearing this, gave his quiet order. She would be escorted safely through their lines and provided shelter. To his men, it seemed an impossible gesture amid the carnage, but the word spread fast. One German woman, spared by the word of an American officer she once saved. In a war of hate, such a story traveled faster than artillery shells. As night fell, the convoy prepared to move. Snow turned to sleet, and the headlights of the jeeps cut through the darkness like searchlights in a dream. Klara sat in the back, her children asleep against her, the soldiers around them silent. Outside, the landscape was a graveyard of machines, tanks half buried in frost, helmets glinting in the moonlight, trees shredded by shrapnel. Every mile felt like crossing the threshold between two worlds. One of the sergeants later said it was the only quiet journey we had that whole winter. When they reached the American command post, Klara stepped out and looked back toward the smoke that marked the ruins of her village. She didn't cry. She only whispered something under her breath, a prayer perhaps, or a name lost to time. The war had taken everything from her except the small piece of humanity she'd managed to keep alive long enough to return. The Americans watched her walk toward the shelter tent, her shawl fluttering in the wind like a flag of surrender and survival. The next morning, Captain Miller wrote a brief note in his field journal. Safe passage granted. 1 woman and 3 children. No incident. He underlined the last 2 words. In a world built on violence, even a small act of mercy felt like rebellion. But far beyond that tent and the frozen valley, the war was tightening its grip. New orders were coming from higher command, orders that would test how long compassion could survive amid the machinery of conquest. And as Klara lay beside her children that night, listening to the distant rumble of tanks moving east, she could not know that her story was only beginning. The next dawn would bring a decision that could end everything she had just been spared. Dawn broke over the ruins of Aachen in a pale yellow light, seeping through the smoke that still rose from the bombed factories. The frost on the ground sparkled like glass, a cruel beauty masking the devastation beneath. American troops were already on the move, their jeeps cutting muddy tracks through the rubble. In the command post outside the city, Captain Miller stood by the field map, reading new orders. Operation Lumberjack, an advance to the Rhine, was underway. Every soldier, every truck, and every gallon of fuel was accounted for. But on the corner of the same table sat a single folder, marked with a handwritten note. Weiss, Klara, civilian, cleared for passage east. It was the only folder not marked for combat. The decision to let her through had not gone unnoticed. Intelligence officers questioned it. The front was crawling with infiltrators, men and women posing as refugees to gather information or sabotage convoys. Yet when Miller stood before the review board that morning, he didn't flinch. Her name's on record, he said, cross-checked with our own casualty lists. Lieutenant Harper confirmed her. She saved his life. I'm not rescinding that order. Silence followed. In war, logic is often bent to fear, but Miller's calm defiance carried its own authority. Finally, the colonel nodded once. Fine, he said, but if she crosses our perimeter, she does it under escort. That escort was a young sergeant named Daniel Rourke, 22, from Boston. He joined the army after losing his brother at Anzio and carried a bitterness the cold could not touch. Yet something in Klara's quiet resolve disarmed him. He was used to seeing civilians broken, faces hollowed by hunger, eyes too numb for tears. But this woman met the soldier's gaze head-on, as if dignity itself were an act of resistance. Her children clung to her coat while she spoke in soft, careful English learned from the American she once hid. When Rourke asked why she wanted to go east, she unfolded a torn photograph. A boy of 16 in a Wehrmacht uniform. My son, she said. He was taken near Dresden. If I don't go now, I will never find him. Outside, The convoys began to move again. Columns of armor rumbled eastward, their tracks grinding the ice into mud. Trucks carried ammunition and rations, but also prisoners, Germans captured during last week's push. Some of them, seeing Klara among the Americans, spat in her direction. Veradarin, one hissed, "Traitor." She didn't look away. Rourke watched her face in silence, wondering what kind of courage it took to endure hatred from both sides. Later, he would tell Miller that she walked like someone who'd already buried her fear. The technical machinery of war moved around her, vast and impersonal. Engineers from the 147th Combat Battalion worked through the night repairing bridges with Bailey trusses, modular steel panels designed by a British engineer, Donald Bailey, whose invention could bear tanks within hours of assembly. Bulldozers roared, welding torches flashed, and cranes swung girders into place while artillery thundered in the distance. Every machine and every bolt of steel represented a network of factories and workers half a world away. Somewhere in Detroit, a riveter tightened the same bolts, now holding up the bridge that would carry Klara to the other side. War was not just fought by soldiers. It was built by millions of unseen hands. As they reached the forward outpost near Stahlberg, the sky darkened with the distant rumble of Luftwaffe bombers making one of their last desperate raids. Sirens wailed, and the convoy halted beneath the skeletal remains of a viaduct. Rourke pulled Klara and her children into a drainage tunnel while flak bursts bloomed overhead like fiery flowers. The explosions rolled across the valley in waves, shattering windows and shaking the earth. The smell of cordite filled the air. Klara held her youngest child close, whispering something in German, a lullaby drowned by thunder. When the smoke cleared, one of the medics found her standing silently at the tunnel mouth, her face streaked with soot. She hadn't cried. She never did. That night, the Americans camped near a cluster of ruined farmhouses. Fires burned low. Rations were shared. In the glow of a lantern, Rourke saw Klara take out the letter, the same fragile paper that had saved her life. She showed it to him. The ink had faded, but the words were still legible. "If she comes, let her pass. She is a friend." Beneath it, Lieutenant Harper's signature curved like a promise against the page. Rourke asked how she'd known to keep it. "Because I knew," she said simply. "Someday the world would need to remember kindness." Her words settled over the camp like snowfall, soft, heavy, and impossible to ignore. The next morning, they resumed their journey toward the bridge at Remagen, where American forces were pushing to seize the last intact crossing over the Rhine. The roads were clogged with retreating civilians, carts, and broken vehicles. It was there, on the outskirts of a bombed village, that Rourke received orders to halt. Ahead lay a field of mines, thin disks of steel half buried under mud, the deadly remnants of German rearguards. Combat engineers began clearing a path, using long wooden probes to detect the faint click beneath the soil. Klara stood watching, her children clinging to her skirt, as the men worked inch by inch. Each explosion was a reminder of how fragile mercy could be. One wrong step, one hidden trap, and compassion would end in a heartbeat. By midday, the road was cleared, and they continued under the distant echo of artillery. At a small village chapel turned field hospital, Klara stopped to give bread to a wounded German boy no older than her son. Rourke hesitated, then let her. "He could be mine," she said quietly, her hand trembling as she touched the boy's forehead. Even amid destruction, her instinct to heal endured. The nurse on duty later said she had the calm of someone who'd already made peace with the impossible. When they reached the riverbank, dusk had fallen. The bridge loomed ahead, a silhouette of twisted steel and cables. Floodlights cast long shadows across the water. On the far shore, American artillery fired tracer rounds into the night, their arcs glowing red against the dark. Rourke was told to wait for final clearance from command. Klara stood beside him, her shawl fluttering in the cold wind, watching the flashes on the horizon. "Is that where he is?" she asked. Rourke didn't answer. Somewhere beyond that darkness, across that river, was the last known position of her son's unit. If he was still alive, that orders came through. Miller himself arrived in a jeep, stepping out into the freezing wind. He nodded once at Rourke, then turned to Klara. "You understand what you're walking into?" he asked. "The fighting's worse east of the Rhine. We can't guarantee anything after this point." She looked at him, her voice steady. "You already did," she said. "You believed me." He studied her for a moment, then handed her a small pouch, bread, chocolate, and a flask of water. "For the road," he said. She took it, bowed her head, and crossed herself before turning toward the bridge. Snow began to fall again as she stepped forward. The steel of the bridge creaked under her boots, the river rushing black below. Every echo felt like a heartbeat. American soldiers watched in silence as she and her children walked into the darkness, vanishing one step at a time into the smoke that still hung over the eastern shore. No one spoke until she disappeared completely from sight. Rourke stood there long after, staring into the fog. He'd seen death 100 times, but that moment, the sight of a mother walking willingly into a war zone for the chance to find her child, was the one that haunted him most. He would write later that some courage doesn't wear uniforms. What none of them knew was that by the next sunrise, Klara's name would appear again, this time in an American field report, carried by a runner out of the fog, with a message that would change everything. The fog had not yet lifted when the runner arrived. His boots were soaked, his breath clouding in the icy dawn. He handed Captain Miller a folded dispatch, edges smeared with mud. The message was brief, written in field shorthand. Civilian Weiss located on East Bank, near Remagen, under American custody. One German youth accompanying. Miller read it twice before looking up at Sergeant Rourke. "She found him," he said quietly. She actually found him. Across the Rhine, Klara Weiss and her children had reached what was left of a farmstead on the river's far bank. It was a place reduced to bone, blackened beams, a half-burned cart, and the smell of gunpowder and rain. American engineers had just secured the crossing, their pontoon bridges swaying under the weight of trucks and tanks. The battle for Remagen was still raging only a few miles north, where the Ludendorff Bridge, miraculously intact, had given the Allies their first solid foothold across the Rhine. The Germans were throwing everything they had: artillery, Luftwaffe raids, even frogmen armed with explosives, but it was too late. The tide had turned. For Klara, though, the war was no longer measured in territory. It was measured in heartbeats, in footsteps, and in the distance between a mother and the boy she had crossed hell to find. The American patrol that discovered her found her kneeling beside a wounded German soldier. He couldn't have been older than 17. His uniform hung loose, his face was pale, and his rifle lay broken beside him. The sergeant in charge ordered his men to pull her away, thinking she was aiding an enemy. But when she whispered the boy's name, one of the medics froze. "It's her son," he said. The words passed like a current through the squad. Moments later, the young soldier, Johann Weiss, opened his eyes. He had been shot through the shoulder during our retreat and left for dead among the ruins. He barely recognized his mother at first, but when her voice broke through the din of artillery, something inside him seemed to return to life. The Americans who witnessed it later said it was the quietest moment we ever saw in war. Captain Miller arrived before noon. The sounds of the front were closing in again. Distant explosions, the crack of machine gun fire, and the low thunder of engines moving east. Yet amid the chaos, the sight before him held him still. The German mother he'd once saved, kneeling beside the boy whose photo she'd carried across half of Europe. Rourke stood a few paces behind, helmet under his arm, watching in silence. "He's barely alive," the medic said. Miller knelt beside the boy and examined the wound. "He'll live," he murmured. Then he looked at Klara. "We'll take you both back across. It's over here." But she shook her head. "No," she said softly. "It's not over until he wakes." For 2 days, she refused evacuation. The Americans set up a small field post nearby, and Klara worked beside the medics, cleaning wounds and sharing her rations. When shells landed close, she didn't flinch. She'd seen worse. One of the doctors wrote later in a report. Her hands, calloused and cracked, moved with the calm precision of someone who had stopped being afraid a long time ago. Rourke, who had thought himself hardened to grief, found himself sitting outside the tent each night just to listen to her hum the same tune she had sung in the drainage tunnel, the lullaby from her village. Even in war, some sounds refused to die. The third day, Johann was awake. The boy's eyes fluttered open to see his mother's face, framed by a shaft of morning light slipping through the tent flap. For a moment, he didn't know where he was. When realization came, he wept, not from pain, but from disbelief that she had found him at all. Miller stood at the entrance, trying to remain unseen. Rourke later wrote in his diary, "We'd crossed rivers and borders, but she crossed something far greater. She crossed the war itself." That afternoon, the Americans prepared to withdraw westward. Orders had come down: secure the civilians and regroup before advancing further into the heart of Germany. Klara and her children were to be transported to a Red Cross station near Koblenz. Before they left, Miller called her over. "You've done enough," he said. "Let us take it from here." She looked at him with tired eyes. "You didn't let me die," she said. "That was enough." Then she handed him the letter, the one written by Lieutenant Harper months before, the one that had opened every gate and spared her every bullet. "You keep this now," she said. "It belongs to the ones who believed." Miller hesitated, then folded it carefully and placed it in his breast pocket. As the convoy rolled out, Rourke walked beside the truck carrying Klara and her children. The roads were lined with refugees, some German, some displaced Poles and French, all walking in the same direction, away from the fire. Overhead, the sky was a dull gray canvas streaked with smoke. Somewhere in that haze, the Luftwaffe made one of its last appearances. 3 Mi-262 jet fighters, fast and desperate, roaring east toward oblivion. Even as the new weapons screamed through the clouds, it no longer mattered. The war's outcome was already written. What remained were stories like hers, too small for history books, yet large enough to fill the hearts of those who'd witnessed them at the Red Cross camp. Klara helped care for other refugees while Johann slowly recovered. The doctors admired her resilience. She barely slept, moving from bed to bed, whispering prayers in German for men who'd once been enemies. She was a healer in a world that had forgotten healing. One American nurse wrote in her journal, "We called her the woman who crossed lines." By April, the front had moved far east, and with it went the thunder of guns. When word came that the war was nearly over, Klara stood outside the camp tents and watched the sun rise over the Rhine. It was the first dawn in years not marked by the sound of engines to in the years that followed. Fragments of her story resurfaced in veterans' letters and after-action reports. One, written by Miller himself, described the encounter with restrained emotion. "There was a woman who reminded us why we fight. Not for victory, but for the chance to be human again." Harper, the officer whose letter had begun it all, tracked her down after the war through the Red Cross registry. In 1948, he sent her a photograph of his family, with a note that read, "Your kindness outlived the war." It hung on her wall for the rest of her life. Rourke returned to Boston and became a schoolteacher. Every year, on the anniversary of Remagen, he would tell his students about a German mother who walked across the front lines to find her son, and about the soldiers who learned that compassion could travel farther than bullets. His voice, shaped by memory and loss, carried the weight of truth. "History will forget names," he would say, "but it never forgets mercy." When Klara Weiss died in 1963, her children buried her on a hill overlooking the Rhine. The river that had once divided armies now carried barges and tourists, its waters calm and indifferent. Among her few possessions was a small wooden box containing her son's photograph, a faded American chocolate wrapper, and a crumpled field pass signed by Captain Miller. On its back, written in German, were her own words: "No war is truly won until someone chooses to forgive." Today, her story survives only in fragments, in letters, diaries, and the memories of the men who met her. Yet in those fragments lies something greater than history itself. The reminder that even in humanity's darkest hour, one act of courage, one choice of mercy, can bridge the unbridgeable. It is said that when she crossed the lines that night in 1945, she did not just walk between armies. She walked between worlds, from hatred to grace. And so, as the Rhine flowed quietly beneath the bridges rebuilt from its ruins, her name faded into legend. But for those who knew, for those who remembered, she remained the same simple truth whispered across generations, that even in war, a mother's love can make soldiers lower their guns.